Welcome everybody to the new Lyre podcast. My name is David Goslin. I'm your host, and I'm joined here by Adam Cedia, who is a poet, essayist, composer, and lawyer. Welcome, Adam.
Good to be back.
Well, I welcome everybody back to the show, and we have entitled this podcast Homer in the 21st Century. We want to talk about Homer. There's a lot of talk about the classics, but not necessarily for all the right reasons, right, Adam? There's talk
Unfortunately.
Getting rid of the classics. We don't need the classics. And there's also, I think, there's often been a failure to define what it means to create a classic, right? What is a classic? And we're not talking classic rock here, Rolling Stones, 1960s. That's not what we mean. A lot of people have tried to define the idea of a classic. It's actually not that obvious.
But I don't think you should poo-poo that. For its genre, it is a classic because it set the tone for what would come after. And if we're talking about Homer, that's really what Homer did. Everything that came after him in poetry, drama, you could even argue fiction, has its ultimate origin in what Homer did some 2,800 or so years ago.
Fair enough. And I guess then at this point, it becomes a question of defining things in terms of quality of idea. I would say you could say quality of emotion as well. Different kinds of art invoke different kinds of emotions. They represent different kinds of ideas. If you take something like 20th century modern art, compared with something like the Homeric epics, you have very different ideas about human nature underlying that. You don't just have different styles and techniques, I guess is the thing that is worth pointing out. In many ways, a lot of modernist 20th century art, and we're going to say all sorts of controversial things. So
And my point wasn't to liken the Rolling Stones to Homer by any means, but it was more to illustrate why Homer is important and why he's worth reading still.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea of reference points is important. There's certain kinds of reference points about civilization, about history, that we gain by investigating something like works of classical literature. I mean, this is a podcast about poetry, art, timeless art. So yeah, when we're talking about classics, we're really talking about something which not only is timeless or popular in its time, but also expresses a universal quality about human beings. And before I was just to qualify that, before I was just saying how if we compare 20th century modern art with something like the epics of Homer or Dante's Divine Comedy, there are very different ideas of human nature, and these are important to investigate. In fact, the works stem very much from those ideas. They're not just, and I think this is the problem with modernism, they're not just art for art's sake, stylistic works, right? Which there was a lot of in the 20th century. New techniques, whether it's throwing paint on a canvas, or imagism, or Dadaism, formalism, which is essentially just following rules, and it's not the same as people tend to associate form with classical poetry, but you can have form and not have classical poetry. I think that's also worth pointing out. But in the case of 20th century modernism generally, and the classics, let's say something like an epic by Homer or Dante, modernism in large part, there's something about it which is rooted in the idea of the inner irrational subjective life of human beings. And that this inner irrational subjective world needs to be given an external expression. but it's largely rooted in the idea that there is this, human beings are in large part irrational. I mean, if you look at the works of Pollock, Kandinsky, these are visual artists, but you'll find the same thing in, T.S. Eliot, and I mean, a lot of 20th century poets. There's an inherent irrationality, which is in large part what is being explored. If you consider something like Homer, there is irrationality among the gods, right? They're largely irrational, but there's also a struggle for meaning within the mortal world.
And I want to back up just a little bit. The early moderns, Eliot, Kandinsky, etc., Virginia Woolf, and the Bloomsbury group, for sure, there was an obsession with Freud. And what Freud did was bring out the id, the irrational subconscious in human nature, and he brought it into focus. It's a key part of his analysis. And I think that Freud obviously had a lot of draw for that crowd. It was something new. It was something that Freud and the others felt was suppressed, and that suppression, caused, the tragedy that was World War I, etc. So it had some draw for them. But ultimately, we see where it's led, to nihilism. In Homer, though, you have, and you could say in classical art in general, you have a struggle between the irrational, which is Achilles' rage, which is, Odysseus. Just staying with Calypso, or talking to the dead, or go when he needs to go back to Ithaca to.
But even the war itself is largely irrational.
Oh sure, yeah, it was over a cuckolded husband, and the theme of the Iliad, in fact, its subtitle is The Rage of Achilles. And throughout, we have that rage being tempered. We have the gods, notably his mother Thetis, and then Athena, persuading him to take action. And then it's finally the tragedy, the death of Patroclus, that motivates him to channel the rage and win the victory that ultimately kills Troy's hero, and it's implied seals the fate of the war. So we have all those elements playing in. We have tragedy. We have the rational versus the irrational. We have the duty, all playing in, these themes playing into the Iliad, and it's really the first major work of literature. And I won't even say surviving. It is the first major work of literature to deal with these themes on such a massive scale and in such a human way.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a counterpoint between, the use of reason and the irrational impulses driving individuals and entire civilizations. And wow, I mean, there's so much that we could say about that, but I think we're getting into the meat of the subject, which is how art is going to treat and approach these things. And again, I think with 20th century modernism, and it's not to poo-poo everything, there are all sorts of exceptions, there are all sorts of variations, but one major theme in 20th century modernism, or especially abstractionism, is the idea that basically freedom is the unleashing of these irrational impulses and desires. And the flip side, which is the Freudian side as well, is that creativity is then the sublimation and channeling of these irrational impulses and desires. But again, underlying that is the assumption that creativity is ultimately something rooted in irrationality. It's random, right? And so you see this a lot in modern art where, there's Dolly. I love Dolly in a sense, that it's very random, irrational. You could say it's alluding to this or that idea, but there's an inherent irrational quality to it. But that's the point, right? It's the unleashing and unearthing of that. But again, if we're not saying that it's just art for art's sake, and we're compartmentalizing the world where art is just the art world and then there's the real world, and we're recognizing that art is in a sense an expression of the world that we live in. It's an expression of the inner world that we are in, but that is very much a reflection of our understanding of the outer world as well, right? Whether the outside universe actually has meaning, or is it completely absurd as well? And so art is, you see this being worked out and struggled with, especially with modernism in this, with this irrational tendency, which is, I mean, it's worth, we can say all sorts of things about it, but it's interesting to observe and to then make a counterpoint with something like the classics of Homer, of Dante, Shakespeare, Keats and Shelley even.
Well, and I don't pretend to be a psychologist or a psychoanalyst, but a Freudian view would be that that irrational, the rational, the ego or superego rather, suppresses the irrational id, and that the repression um, finds its expression in all sorts of unhealthy ways. So what would be healthy is to let that irrational id roam free. And that's what a lot of, the what's called abstract expressionism is. What's being expressed is the irrational id. That's where you get, Jackson Pollock and things like that.
Or even, yeah, art generally, right? Like art is your area to express yourself because you can't do it in real
Yeah,
life.
yeah, and Dali is an interesting case because it's the irrational dream world, but it's channeled through it is channeled through the rational superego, in that there's form and art, technique to the actual creation of the work. It's sort of a middle ground, I guess you could say, between classicism and pure abstract expressionism.
Mhm.
Um, but we're kind of getting afar from Homer there.
Yes and no. Yeah, I mean, I think when we're talking about the classics, right, the idea though is, I mean, you'll find certain, okay, let's, things like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey largely shape the character of a civilization. You could say the same thing about Dante's Divine Comedy, right there. I mean, I think people don't, recognize this enough even. I mean, especially with 20th century modernism, something like Dante, again, it's interesting, right? It's treated as interesting. Oh, wow, look at how interesting hell is. Look at all, I mean, Dante's a brilliant poet, so there's an appreciation for his vivid and compelling descriptions. But again, the comedy is not about vivid and compelling descriptions as such. Those are a vehicle for communicating a certain idea about the nature of human beings. And I mean, I don't like to do this, but to jump to the end of the comedy, when Dante is looking into the light, the brightest light, and it's he can't see any further into the light, what does he see reflected back at him? He says, I saw an image of a human face. I saw an image of my own face. That's that's quite compelling right there. What does that even mean? Right? So when he's looking into the divine light, he sees a human face reflected back at him. And this was actually the idea of the Trinity, right? And which ultimately shaped the ideas of the Golden Renaissance, which is that every individual was in the image of the creator, i.e., the creative principle, God, people call it different things, that designed or shaped the universe. That quality was also inherent in man, in human beings, through creativity, through their intellect. And in a sense, what Dante's saying there is that we can know creation, we can know the principle of creation, never perfectly or absolutely, but in as through a dark glass, by our own qualities of creativity, our own capacity for love within ourselves, which is inherent in every human being. And obviously, if you're living in an oligarchical system, right, you're living in literally this feudal medieval system where society is largely defined by an aristocracy, with bloodlines, and basically their power is based on your blood, your lineage, heredity. And if your father was a farmer and your mother was a farmer, you're a farmer, and there's nothing you can do to change that. So it's a static universe. It's a fixed system, and everybody has their place. But naturally, the Christian idea of the Trinity, which is what Dante he basically saw himself in the tradition of Homer, but introduced the Christian outlook, and created his own epic with that. Again, this idea was obviously, this changed the course of history, right? Because people also couldn't read Latin, right? Italian was a vernacular, right? It was what the people spoke. And so people could actually now have access to these beautiful and profound ideas, which also state that every individual had this sacred inner spark. And it was not up to an oligarchy to define what every person's status or worth was. It was actually a question of developing those noble qualities within, which are universal, are found in all of us, and creating a society whose purpose would be to develop and unleash that to its fullest potential.
Well, yeah, two things I want to say about that is first, Dante makes his guide through heaven, purgatory, and hell Virgil, who was to Latin what Homer was to Greek. In fact, Virgil consciously copied the Homeric epic form into his own Aeneid, and indeed, the Aeneid is the story of the Trojans after the fall of Troy. It's a continuation of the Homeric epic into Latin, and really the transfer of the Greek story, the Greek epic story, into Italy, literally by the voyage of Aeneas into Latium, and the founding of the line that would eventually lead to Romulus. And then the other thing too is, and I don't want to get too far afield here, Dante, yes, most of Europe at the time was, in the feudal system, but he was from Florence, and Florence and all the northern Italian cities at that time were a bit different. They were mercantile cities where you had the raw materials, the silks and the spices coming in from the Silk Road into Venice, and they were being processed and then sold to the nobility through the rest of Europe. So you had, a thriving proto-capitalist system there, and there was social mobility up to an extent within these cities, and that's the environment Dante came from, where he had, in other words, he couldn't have come from anywhere else in Europe and still have been Dante, because I would argue that environment made him and gave him that outlook, where there was some limited ability and some limited freedom. And the other point is the writing in Italian. it was some when some and a native Italian speaker once told me, we didn't just decide to stop speaking Latin one day and start speaking Italian another day. What Italian and all Spanish and all the others started out as was just bad Latin. So the Latin that was, prayed at the mass and written in the universities was educated people speak. It had just diverged so far from what the common people spoke that it was a different language. You can see it today if you ever visit Jamaica, and the people speak to you in one English and they speak to each other in what we would call a dialect, but it's totally unintelligible to speakers of the King's English or the Queen's English, I guess. And what Dante did in writing the epic in Italian was elevate the vernacular to the level of Latin by creating this massive work that specifically sees Virgil as its antecedent and by reference Homer. Dante is creating a new tradition and really lifting, creating a new language. No longer is Italian just, vulgar Latin or stupid people's Latin, street Latin. It's its own language with its own literature now.
Yeah, I mean, number one, he unified the language, right? Because now people had a common language which they could all refer to, which also served as a vehicle for communicating what someone like Shelley would call impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature, right? They were able to talk about the universe, investigating the universe, the nature of human beings to creation, their creator, the universe. Different people are going to say that in different ways, but it's the concept which is crucial, right? And I mean, like you said, he was drawing directly from Virgil, and again, Dante didn't know Greek. His access to Homer was through Virgil. He didn't have access to the Greeks directly, and they were in a dark age, by the way. So it's not like all the literature that we now have access to. I go on Amazon all the time, order stuff. I should probably change company from things like this. But anyways, I always have books coming in, and I just something hits me. I want that, and I can order it. That was not the case with Dante, but so Virgil being available actually became his guide, not only to that the to antiquity, but also to a fine vernacular, right? A fine poetic language, and being able to use what he learned from the Latin and channel all these poetic characteristics and find find the natural music in the Italian, the natural poetic characteristics of the Italian language, right? Dante did not write in dactylic hexameter. He wrote in hendecasyllables, which have certain stresses on the 6th and 10th syllables generally, but that's because it reflects the musicality of the Italian. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. And so that's carrying the idea forward. So yeah, but this idea of tradition, I think now we're getting to it, right? The idea of the classics and how these ideas are carried forward, but also how, as you said, Dante created a new tradition. And I think this is one of the challenging concepts, or when I read a lot of stuff on the idea of tradition or even on the idea of classics, there's a harkening back to the past. But when we think of any great classic, it really was doing something original for its time. So creating new classics today also means doing something original, but also, there are reference points. It's not year zero, which is what I think of. In many ways, this is what the modernists wanted to do, right? It was just like, we're starting from scratch, we're doing our own thing. as if that can really be done, you know, as if you can just pretend the past doesn't exist and be like, yeah, sure, there was that, but now we're going to do something different. That's not how progress, that's not how evolution and ideas work. There are discontinuities, there are fundamental breaks, but there's also this question of building on the richest and best traditions of the past, right? And creating something new and original within our own age, which has that same timeless quality, which we can see in the past.
Well, and that's why I think, you know, T.S. Eliot has such a um, avid following among, you know, what we would call conservatives today. Is if you read The Wasteland, he's mourning what was lost in World War I, and he wants to sort of pick up the pieces and you know, cherish what's left. But the problem is all he's doing is picking up the pieces, and we have these fragments of images, and he doesn't really do anything with them. What Dante, and Dante lived in a similar time. He, you know, the Black Death it was sweeping through Europe. The papacy had moved to Avignon. It would turn out only temporarily, and you know, you had the rapidly changing, you know, the awful political climate of his northern Italy of his day, which resulted from the wars of Frederick II against the papacy. And what Dante did with it is what T.S. Eliot doesn't quite do, was he picked up the pieces and created something new that preserved what came before but pointed a way forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And well, I mean, this became popular. I mean, there's so much that could be said, right? If we actually, and it's important to go back to the past to consider as well what you're saying about Eliot and the feeling of despair, especially with the war. And this continued after World War II, right? I listened to a great podcast, which was on modern art, and it had a very favorable um, idea of it was what's wrong with red, yellow, and blue. It was something called like that. It's a famous painting, red, yellow, and blue, or
By Mondrian?
no, but it's, you know, it's three colors. And the the one of the things that they pointed out though is that after World War II, there was this feeling of how could we compose, you know, another Ninth Symphony or a Mona Lisa, right? How who would dare try and create something beautiful like that in the face of the darkness and horror which we now saw humanity was capable of, and how naive it would be to try and actually create something beautiful like that again. And the focus really shifted to saying, well, no, we have to explore this darkness, right? This irrational, this evil, right? We're, you know, we're brave. We're going to go there. But then you have the paradox that, okay, so, you know, we're breaking with the past. We have to face this, you know, contemporary reality. But if your art just becomes a mirroring of all this evil and ugliness in society, and you trying to sort of wrestle with that, where do people look for high and noble ideas, right? For how, where do people look to better themselves, if not art, which should be sort of immune and above the vicissitudes of any given age, right? And be able to sort of go beyond that, right? This is what Schiller talks about, that art is able to capture the ideal. Art should not be weighed down by, you know, the matter and practicality of any given time or age. It's free from that. You don't have to be weighed down by that. But on the flip side, if your art just becomes a, you know, this idea of reflecting the contemporary world and life within the contemporary world, well, that means that the uglier and more destructive your society becomes, the uglier and more destructive your art's going to become. And that's how do you get out of that? There's a paradox there. Or what is the role of art in that ugly society?
Well, exactly, and the that outlook you referenced, that's the famous Theodore Adorno quote. You know, how can anyone write poetry after Auschwitz? Well, I mean, that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If you throw out the ideals that that's saying because we fall short of these ideals, we should therefore not have any ideals because it just puts us to shame or something like that. You know, that's an argument. You can't be a hypocrite if you don't have any standards. So, you know, why have any moral standards? That doesn't make you a good person. It just means you're an awful person that that doesn't acknowledge that there's anything good out there.
Well, that makes you a realist today, right? That this is,
But that's what they would say, yeah.
it's cynical as hell, but this is really, and I mean, you see this in the culture, in cinema, especially. I feel like cinema is a very powerful medium, especially, I mean, with lockdown, everybody's getting their fill. But if we go this idea that poetry shapes the character of a people, of a nation, of a civilization. If we look to Homer, I mean, this has shaped civilization. If we look to Dante, these have shaped civilization in ways that are hard to imagine, right? Because they actually speak and touch the soul of people. And that's not really something measurable in terms of how it has affected uh, history. But again, but it's not political, didactic, prescriptions. It's doing something more profound, more intense, and more beautiful, which is really really diving into the essence of it, and I mean, finding a way to tell a story as well, right? What this idea that they're creating stories which allow us to make sense of everything going on in the universe, going on in life, right? I was reading.
You're building a world, and not just the world that's in the story itself, but if the story is powerful enough, as in the case with Homer and Dante, you are building an actual world, a civilization. um, I didn't want to cut your thought off there, but what Dante did, again, taking what came before and assembling it into something new going forward, that's what Homer did as well. In my research, I came across an article that was fascinating. It said some of the Homer drew from earlier oral epics that were sung and assembled them for the first time into a single coherent written work. But some of the lines, uh, if you do if you scan them, the meter doesn't fit unless you pronounce it according to the Bronze Age Mycenaean pronunciation. So some of these lines actually date back to the time of Achilles and Agamemnon. And but again, what Homer did, like Dante, was take these earlier songs and assemble them into a single coherent story that created a world and that gave meaning to his world, um, and would serve as the inspiration for Virgil, Dante, Milton, you know, if through ages untold, and ultimately would lay the foundations for classical Greek literature. So when we talked about Dante in this show about Homer, but really Homer was the first Western poet to do that, and Virgil and Dante and Milton and Others, you could say Goethe did it with Faust, and others followed in his footsteps in creating these civilization building works.
Absolutely. And I mean, if we're this idea of poetry shaping the character of people, I think is important, because it also begs a few questions. I was thinking about this earlier. Sorry, I don't know why I'm laughing, but yeah, I think it's because it's a contentious idea. Shall we allow the poets into our republic, which is what Plato talks about? And you know, people throw out all sorts of things when you get to that discussion in terms of whether they're treating it very literally, as if Plato's making these prescriptions about what you can or can't do in art, and basically just pulling a Kim Jong Un and telling everybody what to do, which I really don't think is what he's doing. And I don't think if anybody reads the dialogues, Plato's really a tyrant. He's getting people to think. He's trying to provoke people's minds. But again, so if there is this character shaping quality, then if for society as a whole, I mean, then yeah, it probably needs to be of good character, right? I mean, if you're writing a poem which shapes the character in bad ways and is just a really dark and evil universe under ideas that underlie that world, I mean, that's not really good for society, is it? Or maybe who cares? Okay, sure, who cares? So people just do whatever they want. That's fine.
Yeah,
But
I'm trying to think of, like, imagine a society where Lady Chatterley's Lover was the foundational epic, or something like that. What?
what's the effect, right? Okay, sure. We do have it. So, but let's have it. But the question is, what's going to be the effect? And I think this is what Plato's getting at when, he's actually having a discussion of, well, we probably shouldn't allow these people, or if he talks about the gods being portrayed as irrational, right? And so that I think this is really a profound idea, right? That what is governing the universe? What's governing the universe? Is it irrational or is it rational? Is it based on reason, or does it not care? I mean, is it indifferent? Which is also an interesting idea, and leads. We can act these things out, though, and I think that's what's important about the Platonic dialogues and about dialogues in general. And really, dialogue is basically the Socratic method. It's the essence of scientific thought, because you're working out an idea, right? You're acting it out. Okay, this is your thought. You think that justice is based on X, Y, Z. Well, let's build a society based on that. And, we probably want to try it out in our minds before we actually, go for it. Creating a super race, I mean, that might sound good on paper, but it can actually lead to all sorts of really crazy things if you're denying that there's any good or bad in the universe, and therefore let's just make our ideal society, and nothing's going to get in our way. Historically, that leads to all sorts of things. So yeah, I think we have to act out these ideas, right? That's what the process of dialogue is about. And so when Plato's talking about the irrationality of the gods, I mean, it's a very profound point. Even, let's say, somebody who's listening doesn't believe in any kind of God or thinks we live in an irrational universe. Well, the point is that think about these people who believe their gods are irrational. How are they going to behave? Versus if they think their gods are rational, if their gods are loving, or if their gods are, scorning, smiting, sort of, irrational. There's John Crow Ransom spoke of a God without thunder. He was one of the leading modernists around the fugitives circle, the Nashville agrarians. And, he says we need a God with thunder, a God without thunder, the idea of a loving God, for example, that's, people should fear God. It should be, God might just come one day and crush your house. And, that's
Well,
what
that's sort of, and we see the Homeric gods sort of at a midway point, when the divinities of, primitive societies are totally irrational. Uh, there's You can try to appease them through sacrifices, but it's not guaranteed to work. You live at their total mercy,
right.
because in a primitive society you are more affected by the vicissitudes of nature, the climate, the weather. Whereas when you get to the god as envisioned in philosophy, Aristotle strikes me as an example, or the Christian God, where it's pure rationality, pure perfect rationality. And then the gods of Homer are kind of a midway point. If
they're
you
very,
read the characters,
they're very human.
they are human. In fact, they're called immortals, and I would submit that the only difference between the gods and the mortals is the fact that the gods don't die.
Yeah, which they're
Right? They get wounded, they fight, they can be persuaded, they get angry, they have emotions, they get jealous, um, and they have rivalries like between Zeus and Poseidon. They're perfectly human in every way except death.
yeah. And I mean, it's a fascinating discussion. And again, this is the kind of thing that you can only really get in poetry and literature, in a sense, where we're able to, people, civilizations are able to work out these ideas and really have a dialogue about, again, what are the narratives, what are the stories that are shaping our lives, what we think our stories are, what we think the story of humanity is, right? You have very different ideas of evolution. And I think one of the ways that everybody's mind, people's minds, I mean, I should say, get uh, destroyed is through these binary sort of ideas about, evolution is either it's the creationist, 6 days, everything was created, no question, forget about, any idea of evolution. Or then there's like the Richard Dawkins,
Mm.
Darwinian sort of
Where it's all random.
random mutation, right? So there's no directionality, which basically it's just, there's no purpose. There's no reason for any of it happening. We're here having this conversation. There's cognitive life in the universe. We're able to make fundamental discoveries, self-conscious reflections, and investigate the principles organizing the universe and actually change our behavior in accordance with our new self-conscious understanding of the universe. So it's a cognitive, self-reflexive, creative process. That's a thing, right? So there's cognitive life. The universe isn't. I mean, if the universe created us and we're cognitive and we're being creative, in a sense, it's like the universe is being creative, right? The universe has created something which has its own free will and is further developing or changing the universe of its own accord. So you could argue that cognition is a principle. It's a fundamental characteristic of the universe. It exists in the universe. And if that's the case, or the random mutation Darwinian idea tries to just, it's all random. You came from crystals. It's all just, it comes from crystals. And it's basically, everything is really just different reorganizations of inanimate matter. So there is no actual principle of cognition. So again, that's another story, just to say. And maybe there's, what about the nuance, everything in between? The universe has created something that is cognitive, is able to reflect and further investigate its own ideas, its own nature, and change its nature according to this investigation. That's an interesting story. And it's neither, the pure creationist idea, nor is it the random mutation, you know, Darwinian evolution. So these ideas about the universe, I mean, they come into play when we're talking about Homer and the gods, and Plato talks about this. And in general, I once heard something fascinating where how humans view their gods, or lack of gods, you could say, itself says a lot about their view of the universe, and their view of their own nature, right? If you view your God as this irrational, smiting, thunder bolting, he's going to kill your family, your wife, and everybody just because, how do you how do you cope and live with that is very different than.
Or as an extension of that, like the Egyptians or the Hindu gods, where they're part animal, where there's the irrationality of animals, symbolizing a random, the randomness, seeming randomness of nature too, as an extension of that, I would add.
Yeah, and I mean, the point is these things are all talked about because both exist. Human beings have there is our irrational impulses and desires, and there are impulses towards noble impulses, creativity, love. But I think the question becomes, which one do you want to accentuate? Which one do you want to emphasize? Which one do you want to cultivate as a guiding principle for your society? Both are going to be there anyways, but which one do you really want governing your society as a whole? And if we're going to have that discussion, and we're going to make a choice about that, something like Plato's Republic is talking about, well, how would we go about it? Were we to do that? And the process itself is more important than the answers, right? I think people freak out because, wow, Plato got it wrong 2,000 years ago, but that's not the point. You could have that same process today and make completely new discoveries, because it's a self-reflexive, performative process. We're acting out ideas. We have new knowledge about the universe, and we can introduce that into the drama, the unfolding drama of our universe today and of our lives. So that's what's crucial. So this idea of arguing about whether the gods are rational or not, it's actually it's very profound.
Well, and you say it reflects the society. There's kind of a humorous Oscar Wilde aphorism that I was just thinking about it when you're having this discussion. It's very profound if you think about it. He said, to be truly medieval, one must have no body. To be truly modern, one must have no soul. To be truly Greek, one must have no clothes. And the last line, you think, ah ha ha, but no, what he's saying is, the Greek outlook is fully human. The Greek gods are humans, just that don't die.
Yeah.
And whereas the medieval outlook was pure rationality, and the modern outlook, the world that was about to be born in Oscar Wilde's own day, was pure irrationality, or pure, um, desire for power and profit and all of that stuff.
Yeah, and as we say, the gods in Homer are human, which means there are some that are better than others, right? Athena is a lot more temperate and wise than Zeus. And it's not by chance that, you know, Athens is named after Athena. Classical Athens derived its tradition or its spirit from these. It was named after the goddess Athena. That's not just random. It wasn't named Mars.
Well, the story about the contest for naming Athens. There was Poseidon and Athena had a contest over who the city should be named after, and each of them gave a gift to the city, and Poseidon's gift was the horse, and Athena's gift was the olive. And the Athenians chose the humble olive. They preferred that, so they named the city after her. And the moral of the story is, yes, the horse is a mighty animal of war, but the humble olive can produce much more. You can grow a grove from it. It produces oil, which you can eat, you can burn as fuel, and has all sorts of uses.
Mm.
In other words, you're looking beyond the surface and into the true value
Mm.
of the object.
Mm-hmm. I actually didn't know that. That's interesting. You know what? I was reading this before because we're talking about the gods, and I mean, this is a poetry podcast, so we should probably read some poetry every now and then. Throw it in. So Goethe treats the idea of gods, divinity. He has a poem called Divinity, which is really quite beautiful. So I would like to read this for everybody, since we're having this discussion.
1 second. Let me grab my Goethe volume and follow along if it's in here.
Get your Goethe volume, everybody.
Yep.
I have the. I don't know if I don't want to, in case that's some sort of trademark or publicity thing. I won't say what volume I have. Divinity by Goethe. I'll wait till you get there.
Yep. We're good.
Goethe, Divinity. Let man be noble, generous, and good, for that alone distinguishes him from all the living beings we know. Hail to the unknown higher beings of our intuition. Let man resemble them. Let his example teach us to believe in them. For the realm of nature is unfeeling. The sun sheds its light over evil and good, and the moon and the stars shine on the criminal as on the best of us. The wind and the rivers, the hail and the thunder storm on their way and snatch one victim after another, and they rush past. And so too does blind fortune grope through the crowd, now seizing a young boy's curly-haired innocence, and now the bald pate of the old and guilty. As great, everlasting, adamantine laws dictate, we must all complete the cycles of our existence. Only mankind can do the impossible. He can distinguish. He chooses and judges. He can give permanence to the moment. He alone may reward the good and punish the wicked. He may heal and save and usefully bind all that strays and wanders. And we revere the immortals as if they were human beings who do on a great scale what the little best of us does or endeavors. Let the noble man be generous and good, tirelessly achieving what is just and useful. Let him be a model for those beings whom he surmises. So that's quite fascinating. Let him be a model for those beings whom he surmises. So your highest idea of, a deity, why don't you imitate those qualities? Why don't you try and be like that? I mean, which is in many ways what we saw with the Golden Renaissance and the idea of the Trinity, which especially took hold with Dante's comedy, right? That human beings are living images of the divine. And again, what part of human beings is divine? Is it, our hair, like Zeus, or I mean, like Michelangelo? Got the Sistine Chapel. He's got the hair. He looks like us. No, it's the intellect, right? It's our creative capacity and our capacity for love, forgiveness and change. So I think that's the idea of reflecting on, how different civilizations view their gods, or the principle animating the universe. It's very profound. And I think, some people say, okay, some people are atheists. Some people don't believe in any sort of God per se. There's usually some sort of value system, and even many who don't say, they still end up having something they feel quite strongly about, that you could say takes on a form of,
Yeah, you could say they make something else their God.
yeah, in one way or another. It could be pleasure, it could be saving the planet, it could be, it could be a lot of things. But uh, the decision, right, the idea, to say the universe is meaningless is as much a value judgment and decision as to say that it has meaning. And I think, especially in modern times, this is the idea that the more scientific take is that it has no meaning, and that everything is basically just absurd, but somehow it's all well organized. And again, there's a recognition of a mystery. And I think this is the starting point for uh, much religion or spirituality, is the fact that there is a mystery. And in a sense, we can consider that a special kind of knowledge too, knowledge of what we don't know, which we can yet hypothesize and think of as a thought object, right? Unknowns, known unknowns, conceiving of the unknown as a concept itself, and all the implications of that. But just to say that, yeah, the idea is it's more scientific to have this objective, cold idea towards the universe, but you're still making a value judgment. Is my point. You're still making an absolute judgment about the nature of the universe. And
It's a worldview, a world, and religion is one worldview, and irreligion is another worldview. You can't escape having a view of the world. That's I would say that's a corollary of human existence. You have an outlook on the world you live in, regardless of how, you know, rational or irrational or warped it may be.
Yeah, it
Um,
will shape your behavior. This will shape your values, your sense of identity based on your outlook. So it has, and art uniquely allows us to work these things out. You know, I actually read an article which I will actually publish by somebody who submitted to the Chain Muse, which is the poetry website that I founded, and he just made the point, and perhaps art, the story of art is the story of man, right? There's a dialogue there as we look at the different classics of different civilizations, of different cultures and the languages. There's a story there. There are different stories, and often there are dialogues among different cultures, and there are fusions of different stories. And that's what's really being worked out. But that means something's being worked out. It's not just art for art's sake. It has a much more a meta function, which is so important, but it's also so broad and so profound that we probably don't notice it. That the amount of influence that it has on how we actually choose to live our lives on a daily basis. When you're just walking down the street, you're probably not thinking about, what's the nature of the universe, and how am I relating to the universe today?
you're not consciously thinking of that.
Exactly, but those stories are there, and you know they're shaping how people think. And the problem today is that there's a lot of I think darker stories, right?
Well, or that's active versus passive existence. I mean, you cannot avoid these stories. You are either shaping them or you are being shaped by them. Don't think that because, it's like saying, well, I don't care about politics. Well, that doesn't change the fact that, you're getting part of your paycheck withheld to pay the taxes that get imposed on you.
Yeah.
So it's there whether you care about it or not. It's the same thing with art or with these, meta narratives of human existence. If you don't consciously, if you're not aware of them and make a conscious effort to shape at least your own life according to your worldview, you will be shaped by the narratives that the more powerful or influential are imposing on you.
That's a great point. I mean, uh, if you, even if you're not thinking about it, right? It's still shaping uh, your ideas, and art is getting you to think about it. Art is getting us to think about our own stories, right? The story of humanity, the story of civilization. And I mean, especially today, there are some there are very radically different ideas of what the history of the United States is, and or the history of European civilization. Um, but there's a reason that there's a war over it. I mean, regardless of even, I think it's useful. We don't even need to take a position on all these things. It's more useful to point out the degree to which it has an effect, and what are the effects of one or the other view. Um, there's a reason that people are fighting over what the nature of the past is. It's because they want to change and they want to influence the current situation. And depending on what your interpretation of where you came from is, that's going to have a major effect on how you see yourself and what you think you need to be doing, your self-worth, the worth of your fellow neighbors and family and society.
And that's the attempt to reshape the past is unfortunately common to many, I would say all, repressive societies in one way or another.
Yeah.
um it happens under, I mean, communism was all about that was Solzhenitsyn. Under communism, the future is always the same, it's the past that keeps on changing. To the destruction of you know cultural monuments. I'll use the example of like iconoclasm in Byzantine
Well, they want to back.
Christianity, or in Islam, or in Calvinism in the Netherlands in the 16th century, just sweeping away everything that came before and starting from scratch.
Well, I mean, they want to ban Homer today. I mean, they want to take it out of the curriculums, which becomes, the effect, you know, is the same. So we're talking, we started by,
Oh yeah, and you see that today, and I don't want to get too, I don't consider this being political, but it's touching on a current issue. That's what this whole woke curriculum outlook is about. It's about sweeping away the pillars of the Western tradition and building something new. It's no different than the iconoclasts or the communists or any of those repressive societies. They want to build something new, and to do that they have to sweep away the past, and to justify that they have to demonize it.
yeah. And I mean, it's obviously, it's a very serious issue when we consider these longer arcs, especially. And I think that's part of it. When you consider, though, I mean, if you actually read Homer and you think about the dialogue between the great poets across history, the dialogue between the great artists across history, I mean, there's an evolution, there's a growth, there's development, there's a cross fertilization of ideas. And this is so crucial, but it means we have to understand what this dialogue is actually about and what's being said. And I mean, that's why I think the again, the themes that Homer is treating um, are so powerful. You write in your essay, right there, why is what Homer's doing so powerful? It's because it's very human, actually, and there are a lot of universal human sentiments and emotions and situations, despite it being a Bronze Age war. um, that's what makes it so powerful. because how is it that we're relating to somebody from like, you could, whatever, let's say it's 1200 years BC, or, you know,
Yeah, roughly then, yeah.
how is it that we're able to relate to that? And how has it shaped our, I mean, again, as you say in the article, which is going to be in the first issue of New Lyre. There's a plug for our new magazine, New Lyre, which should be out before the end of May. Why read Homer, right? There's a universality in what Homer is doing, and it has in many ways shaped a lot of good things about how of the artistic traditions of Western civilization. I mean, there's some powerful stuff. And the fact that it's been around for so long is, I mean, that should be a first approximation. Of course, it's not everything, but you go into this.
But it says something that, people took the time to sit down and listen to a recitation of it in ancient Greece,
Right.
and that medieval copyists who didn't believe in any of the gods, that are portrayed in there, or believed they were false idols who were commanded not to be worshipped, that they took the time to write out by hand all 24 books of the work, says something that there is a value there, that so many people from so many time periods thought this was worth preserving.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole podcast on just this poetic, the oral tradition, right? The tradition of recitation, and how important that is. Why don't families just have poetry nights? Why is that not a weekly thing? You know, why are children, there used to be a tradition. I know when you talk to people from older generations, they had to memorize poems and poetry, and it has many effects, that many very uh, good uh, qualities when you're forced to memorize and recite a poem, because you're forced to think about what you're actually saying in a way that we arguably don't think about when we're talking just from day to day. Or if you read a small poem of just two quatrains, and you think about what it says, and then you compare that with what you talked about with your friends at McDonald's, or wherever you eat. I mean, um, it's a nice contrast. Flip side, a lot of people remember those poems, but it wasn't always a good memory, in the sense that they were drilled into the head, which isn't good either. But again, the idea of a poetic culture, of being able to communicate in terms of irony and in non-literal ways, which compel the mind to change and to make leaps and to conceive of things that are outside of its scope of reference. I mean, that's everything. If you can't do that, you're I mean, our society's in trouble. Our kids are in trouble, and they are in trouble. So, um, and because we've lost these kinds of traditions.
Well, and then I can't remember where I read this, but it pointed out that communal singing has, as recently as 50 years ago, it was a common event, and now it's kind of stupid, and the only people who do it are old people. But I think about that, and yeah, at every gathering, you sing a song together. Um, which isn't that far from reciting poems together. I
It's
mean,
part of the thing. Yeah.
that's where this epic oral tradition comes from. And a lot of that, to blame for that, is just the hyper fragmentation that technology has. It allows each person to sort of live in their own world, and with heating and air conditioning and the internet and television, and you're not, there's no motivation to go out and actually interact with other flesh and blood people.
Yeah.
And all of these traditions that created the world, that built this world, are disappearing.
Yeah. So it's, I mean, yeah, it's preserving something. And as you said, I mean, this stuff goes far back, but it goes far back for a reason. And I mean, I mean, here's something, try and do that with free verse. Um, you can still do it. There are some interesting free verse poems, but there's a reason that, I mean, even if you look at lyrics for songs, whether it's modern songs or, you know, uh, 18th century, German art songs, right? The idea of rhyme and musicality. If you think of most pop songs, they have that same quality. And I mean, it lacks a lot of substance, you could say, a lot of popular music, but it's still,
But they're easy to memorize. You can hear people sing pop songs to themselves as they walk down the street,
there's a reason.
without headphones even.
Yeah.
Free verse, I've poems with rhyme and meter are easy to memorize. After a few glances, you can get them down. Free verse is much more difficult. Free verse is designed for the printed page.
Well, that, yes. And I mean, it's also though that the structure is only a shadow, right? The point is there's an idea, and ideas have structure. That's the reality. A poetic idea is not random, right? If you read, a poem by Goethe or by Heine or by Homer, that one will take a bit more time, or a Canzone by Dante. There's the composition of an idea. The words on the page, the stanzas are really just variations and development of that idea. And I mean, I think in a sense, classical music is one of the most useful uh, examples of that. If you take like a Bach fugue or something, there's themes and variations. And how is a seemingly simple musical idea, just a handful of notes, transformed into something much more complex, harmonious, with depth, right? With nuance and meaning and irony and
Or look at Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, that dun 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 dun, that forms the basis for an entire symphonic movement.
yeah, or the Ninth Symphony, which was composed after a poem by Friedrich Schiller, his Ode to Joy. Na 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 na. It's the point is that you can do that with all ideas, not just musical ideas. And this is what poetry is doing. So when you're dealing with quatrains, when you're dealing with couplets, rhymed couplets and quatrains, you're dealing with the development and elaboration of a certain idea or theme. And it's, you haven't, in a lot of poems, you can find something like an opening musical statement, right? Or a question or an image. And then to keep unearthing that and to keep finding more meaning and finding out, wow, this is actually a lot more rich and complex and has a lot more meaning than it seemed at the surface. And I mean, guess what? The whole universe is like that. All of life is like that, which is what's so exciting. I mean, it's pretty exciting once you start to think about that. And if we can find all that in even a small poem, and then you think about all the richness and irony in something like Homer's Iliads and Odyssey, my God, we need more of that. We need new classics, new epics, and they might not take the same form, right? I think that's also important. Like, it doesn't mean that the Homer of today is going to write, dactylic hexameter for how many thousands of pages is it? Uh, but it could be, or Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote dramas for the stage, but we have screenplays today. And cinema is so powerful. Now imagine if there was something of Shakespearean quality and our own English adapted to that quality and degree of complexity and richness. I mean, it's maybe it's done sometimes, but
or think of Wagner, who wrote his own libretti and the music, composed the music
mhm,
to his operas to create this union of all the arts, he called it.
right.
It'll take,
Oh,
just as an example, it'll take, these take different forms in different ages, but and then the other thing all of these do, Homer, Shakespeare, Dante, Wagner, they all drew from previous material to and put their own stamp on it to make it their own work, to serve as an inspiration for others going forward. And you can argue that that's the exact opposite of what the year zero, wipe everything out and start fresh view is. A true epic, a true um, establishing work of tradition builds on what came before and carries it into the future. It doesn't start from a clean slate and make no assumptions about a pre-existing world.
yeah, and I mean that's actually requires more creativity than starting from a blank slate in a sense, because you don't actually have any reference point or anything. You could technically
Make it up. Yeah.
yeah, but again, I mean, I think the classical tradition, whether it's Homer, Dante, Keaton, Shelley, echoed this Greek tradition, and I mean, their lives were cut short, and I mean, there was all sorts of things that could have been, uh, as well. They were in a pretty oligarchical, backwards system in many ways in terms of how things were being run, compared to today. Let's say where okay, those statements could mean a lot of different things.
I was going to say, are you sure about that?
I mean, it's yes and no. It's a yes and no thing. But just to say, you have to break the rules when you're being creative, right? So a new classic means you're breaking the rules at this, or you're adding something new. You're doing something different, but you're also, you're doing it within a certain context. So it's not, there are certain rules or boundaries that you're also working within, and you're trying to make it your own, because you're not an empty space. You're not in year zero. You haven't cut the heads off of all, the scientists and brought out the guillotines like the Jacobins. We have traditions, but that's a good thing, because we can actually, take the best of these things, take the best of the past, and find ways to do something completely new. Um, but to do it in a lawful way. I think this is what Beethoven once said when he said, "As rigorous as it is free." Beethoven broke the rules, quote unquote, all the time, but he did it in a way which was lawful, which actually led to new, profound discoveries, new states of new. I don't know. You can call it harmonies, new musical. Uh,
No, it wasn't even new harmonies. If you do a harmonic analysis of any of his works, even the late ones where he was really breaking new ground, they are harmonically very, very rigorous. I mean, they follow the rules. Um, Yet the way in which they express themselves is entirely, unprecedented. And I could only imagine what people listening to those works for the first time thought. But if you look at them and you look at the notes on the page, it's very orthodox, both in its harmonics and in its formal structure. Um, and you could say the same thing about Shakespeare or Dante too. It's formally, it's Dante's poem formally is follows its strict meter, and it doesn't venture into heresy. It has a very orthodox view of the universe and of God. yet it does this entirely new thing by venturing literally through hell, purgatory, and heaven, and meeting people along the way, and creating its own narrative from this framework that's been established by the society in which Dante lived.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so many. I mean, first off, the Inferno, hell. You could also, there was the underworld in the Greek tradition, and I mean, you have similar scenes, right? Or even in the Aeneid, uh,
Oh yeah, there you go. I
an
mean, you
interaction with the dead going down. Dante didn't just dream this up, or it's not like he just read a verse about hellfire in some sacred text. I mean, it existed.
and Milton does the same thing in Paradise Lost, where he has Styx and Lethe and classical references to the underworld in his description of hell. So yeah, they're fusing classical and Christian belief into their work.
Into something new, and
Yes.
original. And that's what we want to see more of in the 21st century: new and original, timeless art and poetry.
And now is a better time than any to do that, because we have so much more experience than, certainly than Homer, certainly than Virgil, than Dante, than Milton. Not only in terms of time, but we've had the age of exploration, and we have knowledge of the traditions from India and China, and even rediscovered works like from ancient Egypt or the Mayans, that previously were undeciphered. We have a whole cultural world out there that we're doing nothing with.
And we actually know that we know of a lot less than we used to think we knew about, because it turns out the universe is actually a lot larger and a lot more complex. And, the Earth isn't at the center, and it's actually, inconceivably vast, which means there is inconceivable amount of things that we don't even know. The amount of unknowns that we are aware of today is much greater, in some degrees, or arguably, that you could say, than it was in the past, because we just, like you say, have access to so much information, which all makes for just a rich, you know, um, there's so much material, right? There's such a symphony of different things going on that we can sort of draw on. And that's what, I think. Yeah. And I think, again, screenplays, I think of Shakespeare and screenplays today. I watch Netflix, Amazon Prime, and I try and look at, okay, the interesting screenplay or interesting thing, but then when you compare it with the quality of Shakespeare, it's like I'm still, you could have something really epic, where if you really get this tradition, and uh, where people are able to develop ideas at that level and adapt them to screenplays. Movies are actually so powerful. Like one movie can really shape or change somebody's worldview, and it's
Think of Star Wars. I mean,
yeah.
my own personal view is it's kind of a stupid plot, for its time it was totally new, and I think the musical score goes a long way in making the impression it did, but that reshaped a lot of, I mean it and it's been commercialized to death, of course, but that was really a groundbreaking epic, in terms of film.
Yeah, and I mean, in Sappho's time, they had the lyric poetry with the kithara or lyre, and I mean, today we have screenplays with musical symphonic accompaniments or whatever. It's different, but it's the same. Just to say there's something different, but there's also something that's the same. And when we actually investigate these classics, and really steep ourselves, what becomes clear is that there are certain things that are unchanging, right? There are these constants. And that's a powerful thing. It's a liberating thing, because then you're starting with something, and you're saying, well, what can I do with this something today. So it's very powerful. I mean, yes, there are rules, but that's a good thing, right? There are traditions, but that's actually what allows us to have a foundation upon which to build new things. If you don't have that foundation, uh, who knows what's really going to stay standing?
Yeah, rules aren't, I mean, some are, but the rules that endure are not, random creations by some arbitrary authority. They're inherent in nature, just like the rules of physics, or they're inherent in humanity.
Mhm.
Um, they're, the existence of the, you know thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or the turn,
Statement,
or
reasoning.
this it's strophe, antistrophe, in the sonnet, that's something that recurs, and you can't just say, oh, it was randomly made up, because it exists throughout times and cultures. It's something inherent in humanity, just like, um,
I mean, just
force equals mass times acceleration. That's not made up. Isaac Newton didn't just say this is the way it'll be. That's inherent in nature.
yeah, and I mean, just to say that you can a lot if you try and really recite a great classical poem, even just a couple stanzas. Um, if you really think about it and you really try to recite it properly and you try to make the ironies transparent and actually look for the meaning in the same way that Bach does with a fugue, with a seemingly simple theme, you'll find that there's a lot going on there. There are a lot of rules, principles at play, and our mind is challenged to unearth those. And I think we need more of that today. We need a living culture of that. And just to maybe end, because you mentioned Beethoven and you said who knows what people thought when hearing that for the first time, because we think of Beethoven as this classical, crusty tradition from the past, but no, actually, the story that I know of is that when people actually musicians tried to play his late string quartets for the first time, they said, we don't know how to play this, and he said, don't worry, it's for the future.
Yes, yes.
So there may be works today which have just that same effect. People may read it and not be sure what to think about it. Um, and that's maybe a good thing as well. It should be challenging. And we hope to publish things like that and find more people producing works like that today for New Lyre, the Chained Muse, and we would love to talk to them. So I think that's not a bad place to end.
All
Um,
right.
thank you for joining us, Adam.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you to everybody for listening. Hopefully you enjoyed the discussion. And we always like to hear from people, so feel free to share your thoughts. And with that said, we'll see you next week. Take care.
See you.